Well, try. Oh. Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. YouTube did a weird thing where it looked like I hadn't started, then it turned out I had started. But anyway, we are here now. So in today's second show, the first show, if you haven't watched it yet, go back and watch Caitlin talk about the Commonwealth War Graves Gardeners and how they dealt with their situation in World War II. It's absolutely fascinating. But now we are looking at a subject we have looked at before, but from a fresh point of view, the complexity of the D-Day plan from the point of view of a joint airborne and troop carrier force. Jeff McGovern is a US Air Force historian, but former 3rd Battalion 505th paratrooper. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Jeff. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for your viewers for watching.
Thank you. So I said a little bit about your background there, but how did you come to this subject? Because in some ways it seems like we should all know this. You know, the putting together of the airborne plan. Well, we all know that they were coming over there, but why did you think this was worth looking at from a fresh point of view?
Well, as you pointed out, I was a paratrooper, and when I was in the 82nd, the Air Force would show up, and I would get on the airplane, and then I'd fall out onto my DZ, and I would go do my mission. And the Air Force, the direction they would go was tell me which way I was supposed to go, and then thank you, Air Force. So I never really thought very much about it. And then when I got out of the Army, went to school, whatever, and I was looking for work, the Air Force has the U.S. Air Force has a historian program. We're all civil service. And so I got a job at a numbered Air Force, 12th Air Force. And it's a planning headquarters. And so as soon as I'm starting to involve with the planning, okay, if this happens or this happens, all the different staff levels and all those pieces come together, it was kind of like an eye-opening going, oh, there's a heck of a lot more to make a joint force work rather than the usual perspective. The Air Force looks at the Air Force and the Army looks at the Army. I had, and kind of modern U.S. military terminology, had become purple, green Army, blue Air Force, and now I'm a purple guy. And so I was looking at this and, wow, this is a lot of stuff going on. And then when I look backwards, if you read most histories, they are focused either on the ground fight or on the air fight. And very rarely do they ever mix. I know they do occasionally, but very rarely do they ever actually show the mixing of it and the success that came out of that. It's normally critiquing each other because one failed or the other failed.
Yeah.
But actually, most of the time, it's a success. So I have been thinking about trying to present something on this for a while, and I pitched this idea to you, and I said, "Well,
and here we are.
Sounds like a good idea." Yep.
And as we'll get into it in the show, but all the nations are essentially struggling their way World War II with getting all their arms to work together. The Italians possibly having it the worst, but the Japanese, Germans, British, Americans, we're all kind of struggling with this idea of making air, sea, and land all work together. And there are bits that work well and bits that don't work well, but we'll get into it later on. So you come on with a PowerPoint, folks. We'll do questions as we go along that pertain to what we're talking about, any kind of big, broader ones at the end there. But I'm basically going to hand over to Jeff now to take us through the subject. Lots of familiar faces, things that we think we know, but I think like everybody else here watching, we're going to get some new perspectives as well. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks. Like what I started out saying, military operations, particularly on the scale of Overlord, are massive undertakings. And I think most histories focus on a small percentage. It's the cutting edge, the tip of the bayonet. I was tip of the bayonet. I'm not taking any credit away from that crap that you get involved with. But in order to be able to be successful at that, there's a whole group of people behind you that put all these pieces together that enabled that fighter to get into the ground and be able to beat whoever he's going to be. He or she now is going to be up against, and that split of telling the tip of the bayonet story, I think, is particularly relevant or in joint operations, and particularly where the one force delivers the fighters, and then the fighters move forward. So whether it's the Navy landing the infantry divisions on the beach, or whether it's the Army Air Forces bringing in the paratroopers and the glidermen into the drop zones and landing zones in Normandy. Normally, the deliverers are left out of that joint story. They're there as kind of a secondary piece. They got them there, and then they're gone. And then it's to the next time, and then they deliver them again. For Neptune, so a joint, just outside of a terminology piece, joint and combined. I'm using the term joint in the sense of that joint means one country's different branches of the military work together.
Yeah.
and combined is when different countries' military work together. And for Neptune, this was a kind of an unusual airborne operation in World War II, particularly for the Mediterranean and the European theaters, in that it was mostly joint. It was U.S. forces delivering U.S. forces, and the Brits delivered Brit forces, and we didn't really work together. Husky, they were together, and every other, and then Market and
Varsity,
cross vessel, varsity,
yeah.
right, is joint all the way through, or combined. But this is kind of unique, and that's partly because of the limitations of the capability and capacity of the two forces. It was joint rather than combined. And then just a quick caveat about when I'm saying joint and the U.S. military, in World War II, the Army Air Forces was part of the Army.
Yeah.
And in the modern day, it's a split thing, right? But for all practical purposes, it was an independent force in World War II, and primarily thanks to our British partners. When we formed the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and the British came over to Washington, D.C. to sit down at the table with us, there was an Army representative, a Navy representative, and an independent Air Force representative. And we couldn't sit at the table having our British partners having one more member at the table. So General Marshall sort of elevated General Arnold, the Army Air Forces commander, to be that third independent, that co-equal branch. And so thanks to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, all of a sudden now the Army Air Forces is sitting at the table equally with the ground forces and the Navy. And then there's a second piece to that. In March 1942, Marshall reorganized the War Department so that he could have better control over it. And he created three forces. He created the Army Ground Forces, the Service of Supply, which later became the Army Service Forces, yep, and the Army Air Forces. And so now three co-equal branches in the Army, and Marshall pretty much gave Arnold the freedom to do whatever he wanted to do with the Army Air Forces. So it becomes essentially a co-equal branch. And so when I'm talking joint, that's what I'm saying. It's the Army Air Forces. Yes, it's part of the Army, but in practicality or pragmatic instances, it's an independent force. And then airborne operations are a joint force by its very design, right? The ground forces can't get anywhere without the air forces, and the air forces, the Troop Carrier Command, really have no mission unless the ground forces are wanting to use that capability of the parachute and the glider. So it is joint through and through. There's no way around it. And then I slide. You me or you slide?
Up to you. You can go.
I do. I got it. I see. Yeah. Okay. So concept of vertical envelopment in war is not new. It's centuries old. But in the 20th century, it was enabled by heavier than air flight that got developed, and the better and better aircraft improvement going on. So the idea of an airborne envelopment or a vertical envelopment is key. So it's a concept, but how do you put a concept to practicality? How do you make a concept work? And that's doctrine in the military. And so doctrine kind of tells you how to execute the concept, not exactly, but it gives you the guidelines to do it. And in this case, airborne warfare, because it's joint, there are at least 3, if not 5 different doctrines going on, almost all at the same time. But there's the Troop Carrier Forces doctrine, and we'll get into that. What does that mean? Which is the focus on picking up, delivering, and then coming back and doing it again from the air. The Ground Forces doctrine, which is I've got a limited size force. I need to do these certain kind of missions. How am I going to enable that with the size of force, the size of weapons, and all that? And then you get when the two come together, right? Which is what Neptune and Husky started and all that. And so there's kind of a third doctrine when they have to sit face to face and say, I want this, I want this. Well, I can't do that. I can't do that. What are we going to come up with? Right? And then there's 2 other doctrines in play here. There's what we call the zone of interior, which was stateside, where they're developing doctrine on how to fight airborne warfare free of conflict. And so they have the new gadgets, they have the free thinking going on there. And then you have combat theater doctrine. So the 82nd Airborne and Troop Carrier Command in the Mediterranean theater, when they execute their missions, they realize, oh, the doctrine as we learn isn't going to work because it's either limited by the capacity or capability or by the enemy's influence into it. And so really you get 5 different doctrines kind of come together, and you hope that they all are going to work together. And for the most part, they do. And I think they really peak at varsity, and then the war is over. And then we kind of forget.
And none of these doctrines you're talking about have really been in existence for more than 2, 3, 4 years, whereas an artillery doctrine has broadly been around for centuries. Supply doctrines, logistics doctrines, in terms of using railway, that's been. But this is all really new and developing fast.
Yeah. It's not, the Neptune is the largest airborne, which is just really a division and a half for the U.S. Because part of the 101st comes in over boat. All we ever did before was regimental size, and so this is really putting doctrine to the test. And what does it do? I think when the Germans used the airborne envelopment, the vertical envelopment in Denmark, Norway, Holland, and Belgium, and then Crete. Senior leaders, civilian and military, I think just saw Germans being successful, right? Crete's a different thing, and you could talk about it a different way. But from our perspective, the reports that we got were astounding. And most of these senior leaders are guys who either experienced World War I in person or lived through the period. Yeah. And what they did not want was a stalemate. They did not want a repeat of World War I. How do I break that stagnant front? Well, I can use airborne. I can use vertical envelopment to do it. So as this new idea, and the Germans do it, both the US and the UK, and their timelines actually pretty closely match from 1940 going forward for their development of the airborne. The only thing the Brits do that the US does is that they don't develop a transport aircraft. Like they do gliders and the parachute and all that other stuff. They just never have the desire or will or capability to build transport aircraft. And they also had this cousin across the ocean who was willing to mass produce and share transport aircraft. And so they didn't necessarily need to do that with it. And I've got, through the presentation, I've just got some images, and my goal is to kind of refer to the images as we go through doctrine. So if you look on the left-hand side there, there's two 82nd artillerymen strapping in an M3 105 millimeter howitzer into a CG-4A glider. And so what you see right there are at least two, if not the 5 doctrines going on. Initially, it was all 75 millimeter howitzers for the divisions, but that's just not enough punch. So they bumped up one of the battalions, the glider battalions, up to 105 to give divisional support. And so that was a theater-driven thing. The movement, the practice of flashing and tying down the artillery or the jeeps or the trailers into the gliders, that's both a troop carrier and an airborne ground doctrine. The soldiers who put the stuff into the glider and secure it are not the glider pilots. The glider pilots may be there to supervise, and they may be there to help with center of gravity, but it's really a ground forces job to put the stuff in the glider and to secure it, to make sure that it's not going to move around when they're flying. And then the glider pilot kind of comes back behind them and just inspects to make sure that they're going on with that. So you get divisional support, you get the idea of the glider force going on there. And on the right-hand side, that was a training exercise on the 23rd of March, 1944. It was a demonstration exercise really for Eisenhower and Churchill to show that we are ready to do this. And it's 101st Airborne with a few of the troop carrier groups just to the east of RAF Welford. And they land and they do they drop, and then they do a small tactical exercise and they do it. And what's hard to see in this image is what's on the ground in the front part of the pictures are bundles, parapacks and bundles. And it's like, well, how do I, back to that doctrine, I have a mission to do as the ground force. How am I going to get what I need to be on the ground? One of the limiting factors in World War II was actually parachute technology and the ability for a chute to handle so much weight. So a paratrooper can't jump with a lot of weight to begin with. And so how am I going to get this heavier stuff there? Well, I'm going to develop parachutes, parapacks, and parabundles. But it's not the ground forces that do that. That's an Army Air Forces thing. So they have to work as a team. The Army ground forces go to the Army Air Forces and say, I need these requirements. Can you develop it? And then they go back and forth developing the chutes and the bundles and the parapacks and all that for coming out of the airplanes. And so again, it's a doctrine is always this moving back and forth between the two of them.
Cool.
So Overlord and an airborne assault. The U.S. I think is always there's that kind of myth. We are brash and want to just go for it. And so Overlord from the U.S. The Joint Chiefs of Staff was, well, if we're going after Nazi Germany, how are we going to go after Nazi Germany? We're going to go straight for them. How do we do that? Well, we're going to go through Great Britain into France and go straight to Berlin. We had not had, fortunately, the experience of war that England or Great Britain had had for the last few years. And so we were babes in the woods in our overeagerness, and perhaps the Britain was a little overcautious because of their experience of war, and it's going to be a mix between the two. Overlord, so again, Overlord's on the table from nearly the beginning, which is a cross-channel attack through France and into Germany. It goes back and forth on how they're going to do it. They have these senior leader meetings. One's in Casablanca, then they have one in a couple in the United States, and they make these senior decisions to launch Operation Overlord. Symbol in Casablanca says we're going to do it, and as part of that, in a little earlier, they had something called Operation Bolero, which was going to be the buildup of U.S. forces in Great Britain in order to execute Overlord. It's not called Overlord at the time, but it's that's essentially what it's going to be. And then you get the North African invasion with Torch, and then fighting in the Mediterranean. It kind of draws away the forces from Bolero, except for one division. Once they make it, they meet again in the spring, early summer of 43. They're going to do Husky, but then after that, they're going to go back to with an emphasis on Overlord and cross-channel assault. And they say we're going to do it in the May of 1942. May of 1944. And they say in order to do this, we need planners. And so they're going to set up a planning committee under this man on the bottom center there, or bottom left, which is Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, who's a British officer, and his deputy is going to be an American, General Barker. And he creates this name. It's his name, and it's also the name of the organization, the Chief of Staff, Supreme Allied Commander, or Cossack. And Cossack is tasked with coming up with a plan for the cross-channel attack. Part of that plan had always had an airborne assault in it, smaller in the beginning, and then it grows in time. The usual story. I don't think you're a fan of Montgomery.
I'm a big fan of Montgomery, but not as a human being.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the usual story, at least on this side of the pond, is that Montgomery comes in and says, "Oh my God, I'm going to change this plan. It's not big enough. I'm going to make it all better, and expand the number of divisions going in, expand the beachheads and all that." Morgan's plan in the summer of 43 actually it was that big. And he was told that it was too big, that we don't have the resources, capabilities, capacities in order to do it. So you need to scale your plan back. So given that guidance, he scales his plan back to the much smaller assault, which is basically from Omaha to the two British beaches closer to it. And then he's allowed, and he's told what kind of airlift he's going to have. And it's basically enough for one partial division and then some smaller division or smaller elements. And so the focus is going to be on Caen as a crossroads. So he pitches the 6th Airborne is going to land and seize Caen. The American element is going to land behind Omaha and what's going to become Omaha and small packet forces to ensure the U.S. forces come in. He goes back to the Combined Chiefs of Staff in August 43. They approve the plan, but they still don't have a senior leader for the Operation Overlord. That's picked in December, and that's going to be General Eisenhower, and his deputy is going to be General Montgomery. And in December, Montgomery and Eisenhower see the plan for the first time. And both of them immediately say, this plan is too small. We need to make it bigger. And we need to expand beyond there. We need to expand into the Cotentin Peninsula. Morgan and his planners go, all right, let's do it. The holdup, though, is actually the ability to deliver the forces, which is then shipping and then the air transport piece of it. When Montgomery and Eisenhower come in January, they sit down with all the senior leaders, which you can see on the right-hand side there. And they come up with, that picture's taken in February, I believe, 1944, and they expand the plan to include the 5 beaches and the Cotentin Peninsula. And the gentleman on that table in the color photo on the left is General Bradley. He's the commander of the 1st U.S. Army. He's the senior American leader for the invasion. And he says, if I'm landing forces in the Cotentin Peninsula, they're going to be too separated from the forces at Omaha. I need something to ensure their success. I want airborne divisions. He already has the 101st, and then they just decide to give him the 82nd. And so he's going to land, he through him, and then Eisenhower approving it says, we're going to involve and expand the airborne forces. But they have to somehow expand the troop carrier forces by doing it at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
Am I going too fast or?
No, it's perfect. We're all on board. Yeah, people are loving it.
So what does it look like for troop carrier and airborne organizations? This is the final organizational structure on the 5th of June. Troop carrier gets activated. There's in the 8th Air Force, there's the 8th Air Force Ground Support Command or Air Support Command, and they have a little bit of tactical airlift, the 315th Troop Carrier Group, but they only have a handful of group planes. In October of 1943, they stand up a tactical air force to support the invasion. That's the 9th Air Force. And when they stand up the 9th Air Force, they establish as part of that the 9th Troop Carrier Command, which mirrors what they're doing in the Mediterranean with the 12th Air Force. And so they give 9th Troop Carrier Command 2 troop carrier groups, the 434th and the 435th, and they arrive in the fall, early winter of 1943. And as soon as they hit the ground, these two troop carrier groups, and they have to integrate themselves into the British system, they start training immediately with the 101st. Now, the 101st had arrived in September, and being paratroopers and glidermen, what do they want to do? They want to jump and fly and land, but they didn't have any airlift. And so when 434th and 435th are there, they immediately start to do joint training together, figuring out how are they going to do this, because they had worked a little bit together in the States, but not extensively. And so you get the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and you get a naval commander, an air commander, and a ground commander. Montgomery's the ground commander, Ramsey's the naval commander, and then the air commander is a person named Lee Mallory, who is subject for people either hate or like.
Big rabbit hole. Let's not bring Lee Mallory in too much here. But I mean, I know we're going to come to it later on, Jeff. But we've discussed Husky, and Husky in terms of the airborne operations, a mixed bag is a polite way, I think, of looking at Husky. But there are clearly enough advocates for airborne warfare to push this idea through, and people to be confident enough to say we need airborne soldiers for Neptune Overlord. So were there any kind of key ambassadors, if you like, that could see the vision through some of the debacles of Husky and say, no, this is what it can do? I mean, is there anyone that you think is instrumental in kind of keeping the airborne troop carrier concept alive?
I think it's the stateside commanders for the most part.
Right.
So Husky goes on, right? It's regimental drops on the U.S. side, and they are scattered now. But almost as soon as it's happened, Troop Carrier Command and the 82nd start to develop a Pathfinder force, right, as a way to fix that and make a less complicated airplane and all that. Eisenhower at this time says, I'm not sure if I believe in a large-scale airborne invasion or assault as part of an operation. And so he's questioning it. Now, back in the stateside, there's General Swing in the 11th Airborne Division, Miley in the 17th, and they're very strong advocates, and they say, well, give us a test. And so there's a series of large-scale tests at the end of 1943 that basically prove the concept, and in proving the concept, they convinced General Marshall, who has always really been an advocate of it. They convinced General Arnold, who's also been an advocate of it, and they convinced General Eisenhower through these stateside exercises that it is possible to do a large-scale airborne insertion and make it a success. Taking the lessons learned from Husky, right after Husky, when the 82nd sends in and drops his 2 regiments over 2 days into Italy, it's a success. Now it's a controlled drop zone within Allied lines, but they drop right on where they're supposed to be. It's a mixture of Pathfinders and training, both joint and individual training as troop carrier and airborne. And so they make it a success. And so Husky, I think, is, every time you try something new, you stub your toe. And then you just hopefully keep on going. And there were enough advocates, particularly stateside, I think, to push forward to go. And Ridgway himself and Gavin and those guys are all also very strong. The commander of the troop carrier force then was going to be the commander of the troop carrier force for Normandy, which is General Williams. General Williams started out the war pre-war. I'm jumping ahead a slide here, but he started out the pre-war with air support commands. And so he's always worked with the Army ground forces. He becomes the commander of the 51st Troop Carrier Wing for Torch. And then he's involved in the early airborne operations as the 51st Troop Carrier Command Wing Commander. And then he gets called to become the 12th Air Support Command Commander. And that's helping Patton and Bradley in Tunisia. And then he goes back to the airborne. Something I've read said that they sent him back to the troop carrier because he was too cozy with the ground forces commander. All throughout this, I'm talking about them working together, but at the same time, they are always looking jealously at each other. The Air Force wants people and money and equipment, and the Army ground forces want people, money, and equipment. And anybody who crosses over too close to the other side, gets too close to the sun, can get burned by their own forces. Williams is pushed back to the troop carrier forces. He does a wonderful job. It's not a punishment. And then he cuts his teeth in Husky and then in Italy, and then is going to be sent up to England for Overlord. So the structure there is for this Overlord brought up questions, and Lee Mallory is part of this. So one more talk about Lee Mallory. Who controls what? So who has control of the 9th Troop Carrier Command and who has control of the airborne divisions? And to the outsider, that sounds maybe like an immaterial question. But what does that mean? If I control the Troop Carrier Command, say I'm Lee Mallory and I'm the Allied Expeditionary Air Force Commander, that means I can tell them what to do. I can tell them what to focus on. I can tell them how to train. Lee Mallory is not an airborne officer. And so the 9th Air Force Commander, a guy named Brereton, who's also very egotistical, is not interested in giving up forces to another commander because then it lessens his force strength. And so they go back and forth, and finally the decision is made that administrative control for 9th Troop Carrier Command is going to rest with 9th Air Force. And what does that mean? Well, that means personnel issues, financial issue, promotions, training doctrines are going to fall through. Equipment issue is going to all be done by the U.S. forces and the 9th Air Force for 9th Troop Carrier Command. When it comes to execution, it's going to fall under the Allied Expeditionary Air Forces under Lee Mallory. The airborne ground divisions are going to belong to the 1st U.S. Army, the 7th Corps, and who they belong to. Like, it's an interesting concept. When an airborne division goes in before the ground forces, who controls them? Right? There's nobody sort of there to actually run them because they have very little communication with the rear, at least in the Second World War. And so they're kind of a force unto their own. So, but they need some kind of guidance, and someone has to be able to control them. And so they're going to belong to 7th Corps and the 1st U.S. Army. And again, it sounds kind of like a little question, who controls me? But it actually is a really big deal when you're in the military about who has authority over you to tell you what you can and can't do. And it was a contentious issue, Overlord. And it doesn't really get worked out until the 1st Allied Airborne Army gets stood up in August.
Indeed. Yeah. Brilliant stuff.
Who are the key planning and tactical leaders? I think most of your viewers will know probably most of these guys. Ridgway is the 82nd commander. He's the commander from the get-go with the 82nd. And when it stands up as the 82nd Airborne in August of 42, he takes the division to North Africa into the Mediterranean, and he takes the division back up to England. He had a deputy commander who was killed in Husky, and then the 505 commander, General Gavin, or Colonel Gavin, and then is promoted to be the assistant division commander. Ridgway sends Gavin early back to the United Kingdom to help with the planning for Overlord. So he's going to sit in on these planning conferences I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Ridgway is a hardcore guy, and he knows his business, and a tough as a nut guy. The 101st, when they came from the States, the first commander was a guy named General Bill Lee, William Lee on the lower left there. And he takes the division from stateside into England, into the United Kingdom, and trains them hard. And he's hard on himself to the point where he suffers a heart attack in February of 44, and they have to send him home because he's not able to lead the division. Who do you pick to replace the 101st Airborne Division commander? Do you pick somebody from within the 101st? Do you pick somebody from outside the 101st? I have a feeling that General Ridgway, and I don't know for sure, had a vote in this, and he picked his artillery division commander, General Maxwell Taylor, to lead the 101st, which at first was not very popular with the 101st because he's from the outside. And to this day, the 101st and the 82nd don't get along. If someone challenges us both, we'll fight together. But if we are by ourselves, we will not like each other. And so Taylor's not exactly welcomed at first. He's a good commander. He's a bit of a political officer, but that's a separate kind of thing. And he becomes the division commander. So from February on, now he's involved with planning not the 82nd bit, but now with having to deal with the 101st. So he has to shift his priorities on what he thinks is the more important things that happen. And you'll see that when we talk about what kind of force is going to come in on the morning of the 6th. In the upper right, you've got the 9th Troop Carrier Command commanders. The first guy on the left is Brigadier General Benjamin Giles. He's the first commander of 9th Troop Carrier Command. He had experience with Air Transport Command before this, and it kind of was always assumed that he was a placeholder. And he's promoted and moved out into the to the Far East to a Far East command in February, when General Williams, who I talked about earlier, gets moved up to the United Kingdom, and he takes over 9th Troop Carrier Command. And then he's an experienced commander. So if you're 9th Troop Carrier Command staff, and I'll get to the A staff and all that stuff in a minute, you've been doing this for a few months, you think your job is secure, you like what you do. Here comes a new commander from a theater with combat experience. And what does Williams bring with him? His staff officers. And so now there's a shakeup at 9th Troop Carrier Command, nothing hostile, no, and like that, but there's a shakeup at the command. And so what 9th Troop Carrier Command end up having as a staff is in theater training. And then he also brings over some guys from the Zone of Interior. So they get new doctrine, new equipment, new ideas. And then he has the staff with the combat experience from the Mediterranean. So 9th Troop Carrier Command is a really well-experienced staff when it comes to planning an airborne operation. Planning staffs and conferences. Maybe your viewers know, maybe you don't. If you're not in the military, sometimes this stuff is a foreign language. there are A and G and S staffs, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. There's the commander and the commander's personal staff. So he's got his aide and his execs and all that. And he has, or she now has the idea, right? I want this to be done. So who does that? Well, that's his staff, his planning staff. And it comes out of the French system, but it's broken down into A1 or G1, which is personnel, and I'll go into what they're going to do in a minute. A2 or G2 is intelligence. A3 or G3 is operations. And then for the ground forces, plans. And then there's A4, which is logistics, or G4 for logistics. And then an unusual move by the 9th Troop Carrier Command at that time is they stand up in A5, which is planning, which on the Army ground forces is embedded in G3. And then there's all these other standalones: communications, public relations, medical, liaison officers, ordnance, chemical warfare. All of these guys on these staffs, and all who these guys are and their subordinates are experts in their fields. So the G3 or the A3 guys know how to plan an operation. They know the steps that are going to need to be filled. They know the checklist. I need to know this. I need to know this. I need to know this if this is going to be successful. And so they're all subject matter experts in their fields, and they're supposed to come together and come up with a plan. And the A obviously, because the Army Air Forces wants to be independent, they can't have a G1 or a G2 or a G3. So they have an A1 or an A2 or an A3, right, for the air piece of it. And they're going to all come together. And they have conferences. Now, they have different kinds of planning conferences. There are 9th Troop Carrier Command planning conferences where they just meet together and come up with a plan. The Army Ground Forces, the 101st, and then the 82nd come up with their own planning conferences, and they have ideas of what they want to do, given that whatever the mission is. And then they have to come together, and they have to hash all of their desires together in order to come up with a successful plan. And that's where feelings can get hurt. That's where, well, I want to do this. I'm sorry, but you can't do that because I don't have this. I remember I didn't say this in the beginning, but I do staff rides, which are like tour groups, but they're for military units. So I'll take a military unit out to a battle space, and I'll go through all the military operational pieces of it. And they're really there to learn about how to, if it ever happens to them, what can they draw on the past in order to execute tomorrow with it? And so they have to go back and forth with these issues about, well, I want you to do this. I want you to do that. And for market garden tours or market garden staff rides, the ground guys are always saying, well, why didn't they just do 2 lifts a day? And it's because from their perspective, a plane flies and it can fly at any time and anywhere, and there's no big deal with it. And they're not necessarily thinking from the air planner's perspective, which is, well, there's actually air support in the morning and there's wear and tear on this very long distance flight. So we can't necessarily do it if there's damage. There's all of these planning factors that come into play, but they don't understand them until they sit at the same table. So the planning conferences are absolutely key in order for making an operation successful. So I'll just go through. There's a lot of words on these next 2 slides. Sorry, I don't mean that to kill you with the words, but it has to do with how important this is in order to make an operation successful. And it's the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why, and H, which is how. And these are the planners. These are the folks who come up with the answers for that, present the plan to the commander. The commander will assess the plan, and then green light it or red light it or tell them to go back and change something with it. And so this is very key for them to do. So A1 or G1 is the personnel. And what does that involve? Well, how many people are going to be needed for this operation? Well, I'm going to need, 500 paratroopers, 600 glidermen. 7 of those are going to be artillery, 5 of them intelligence. I'm going to need 50 power air crews. I'm going to need 60. The numbers are kind of imaginary. 60 glider pilots, right? And so where are they going to come from? For the glider pilots for Operation Neptune, each troop carrier group has a certain amount of glider pilots, but not all the groups flew gliders. And so some groups flew more gliders than they actually had glider pilots for. So where are these glider pilots going to come from? So the planners in A1 will look at the whole unit and say, well, you've got 10 extra glider pilots. You've got 50 extra glider pilots. I need you to send them to this other organization, and they're going to fly with this other organization, which is going to have all kinds of other issues for the glider pilots. But that's one of the things A1 does. Where do the people come from? How am I going to feed and house these people? And so that's going to be connecting with the A4 logistics piece, and it's going to connect with the service of supply piece. But they have to say, well, I'm going to have 500 people at this location. I need them to be fed and housed and sheltered in some way. And so they have to come up with that number to say to the other bits and bobs, the other staff, I need support from you in order to be able to do that. Pay is an A1 personnel thing. Soldiers need pay. If they don't get paid, they get very grumpy. And in this case, what kind of pay do you need? Well, and when they get to England, they're paid in UK currency, which means that the finance people have to be able to go to the Bank of England and get British currency exchanged for US currency, and then go and then pay the servicemen in the British currency. And then you can make it even more complex. Well, where are they going to go in this operation? Oh, they're going to France. Well, we can't have them use British currency in France. We're going to need French currency. And so they're going to have to then again, come up with how much currency do I need, which is literally in the millions and millions of dollars. And then I'm going to have to figure out how to distribute that. And then there's all the security aspects and all that kind of stuff. How do you track personnel? I'm part of the National World War II Glider Pilots Association. And one of the things that we do is relatives ask us about their relative, what they did as a glider pilot. And so you go through the records, and how do you know somebody was where or how they did what? And it's because it's the military. One of the things they do is every morning there's something called a morning report, which is a tally kind of what the unit is doing or done and who's missing or who's gone somewhere. There's orders for detached service that they're going to send say, for example, a glider pilot to another unit. There's going to be a paper piece of track of that. Casualties. How do you track casualties? Or how do you know you have a casualty? And then how do you keep that paperwork going? That's all an A1 personnel thing. And so they have to be prepared in order to be able to execute this mission doing that. A2 is intelligence. Their initial job is to assess the enemy and then provide the enemy situation to the planners and to the commander. And so that when the G3 and the G5 and all that are coming in and say, okay, well, there's going to be such and such German forces here, I need to be able to prepare to be able to overcome them in some way with a certain amount of force. And that assessment is going to come from the intelligence piece. A2 is also the one that provides operational security, right? So when the plans get distributed or when the maps are created, how do you know they're going to be secure? Well, A2 sets up the security plan to say, well, these bases are closed. This part of the base is closed. This is going to be called top secret, bigot, whatever the level of it is. And they help control the distribution of information in order that the enemy can't get it. Map production and distribution. Again, that sounds like, oh, maps. And there are literally tens of thousands of maps, paper maps going to be distributed to the air and the ground guys. And they're going to be different kinds of maps at different kinds of scales. And where are you going to get all that? And how are you going to get the production of it in order to be able to distribute it in a timely manner so that the forces can actually make use of it? And that's another A2 function to be able to do that.
And just to jump in with my two penneth worth here is that those particular things you just said, that they're all cranked up in importance when you're talking about airborne divisions, because of security, you're tending to be jumping behind enemy lines. You haven't got that support coming in immediately behind you, so that's even more important. And maps and knowing where you are. Again, you're even if the jumps, glider landings end up perfectly, you're still talking about lots of people split up in essentially small groups compared to, for example, a regimental combat team landing in an amphibious assault, where you've got more people together in one place theoretically. So these things are sort of standard across the army, but in an airborne division, the intensity, the importance is maybe at a higher level.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, there was I think his name is Milshka, a Czech officer who wrote a book called Paratroops, Interwar. I think he was under de Gaulle, and in there, there's a map of how would you conduct an airborne assault, and he's got basically Cotentin and Omaha as the target. And Taylor saw this book, kind of freaked out a little bit, worked with the A2, going, wait, does this guy have some kind of knowledge? It happened to be this guy was a good planner when he picked, if I'm going to land in France, this is where I'm going to go.
Right. Okay.
And so, but A2 got involved, and there's some other issues, other events like that too. A3 is the operations piece. In the Ninth Troop Carrier Command, they also then open a planning piece, but in the G3, the 82nd, and the 101st, they just keep it all in operations and planning. What are the requirements to do this? So, for example, the 101st is given the mission initially to basically seize St. Marglis and then also to secure the causeways. And so the G3 folks have to say, okay, well, what is that based on the A2 intelligence? What is it going to take for us to be able to be successful at doing that? And so they have to, how many forces, what kind of forces, the timing of it, and all that. They have to come up with all of this matrix to say, and we'll look at the matrix at the end of the presentation to get them there to do it. And then it's, how do I get those stuff? And then this is where they have to talk to the other staff members and other outside organizations. Well, how am I going to get them there given these requirements? And what are they going to need? So there's, for example, there's an A to Z kind of, or A to W list there. Ammunition, radios, batteries, navigation aids, fuel, medical support, transportation from home billets to the marshalling areas and the airfields, weapons systems, for example, artillery and any tank guns. What do you need to be able to be successful? One of those categories in there is something I think that's always taken for granted until you are actually in the ground, which is batteries. So radios operate off batteries, and the backpack, the walkie-talkie, and all that. And if you don't have batteries, you don't have radios. If your battery wears down, you don't have a powerful enough radio. You're not going to be able to speak as far. And these are 1940s batteries, which are pretty big and heavy. Yeah. So you have to plan that you're going to have extra batteries. If you don't, then you've just lost the comm piece of it. And so that little thing, if you don't have the batteries, the right amount of batteries, your plan's going to go awry right from there. But same with ammunition. You jump with a radio, or you land in a glider with a radio, you know you're going to have a rough landing you expect a rough landing, or you're going to have extra radios packed in there in order to be able to replace the broken radios. You better make sure that you do all that. Navigation aids for the Pathfinders. Do they have the holophone lights? Do they have the BUPs? Do they have all the stuff that they need in order to be able to work with that? And do they have the equipment that's going to be able to work with the troop carrier community? Marshalling, and I'll get to marshalling when we get to one of the airfields. A4 logistics, again, what are the requirements the other staff require, and how am I going to get them that stuff in order to be able to do it, or how am I going to coordinate that they can get that stuff? In England, in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, Operation Bolero, part of Operation Bolero was the establishment of the special SOS, Service of Supply, which is going to later become Army Service Forces. And it is massive. I mean, it is massive. The end piece of this operation is huge. The guys who never fire a shot. And they're sitting there, and they divide up England and Scotland and Northern Ireland into different zones. Where the Airborne is, it's the western base or the southern base section. And so they have to coordinate. A4s have to coordinate with these logistics people to say, I need 500 rounds of 105 millimeter of this kind of 105 millimeter, not that kind of 105 millimeter. Same with 30 caliber. All of that kind of stuff. So they have to go and coordinate with all these outside agencies to be able to bring the stuff. And then they have to coordinate the transportation. Is it going to be their transportation that's going to go pick it up? Or is it going to be Service of Supplies transportation that's going to be bringing it? And then is there going to be somebody there to sign for it? Where do I store it? And so it's a really complex piece of thing with it. Weapons, do I have enough M1 Garands? Do I have enough M1 carbines? Do I have enough M1A1 carbines? The troop carrier folks, we're always looking for, you look through the records, and every month there's a request for flak jackets and M3 fighting knives. Why M3 fighting knives? That somebody decided that every glider pilot needed an M3 fighting knife and some of the aircrew. And the flak jackets were because troop carriers are transports. And so in some eyes, they are non-combat crews. And not thinking that, oh, you know what, they actually fly into combat and get shot at with no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. What protection do the crews have? Well, the crews want flak jackets, either to sit on or to wear, and then helmets in order to wear. And so there's always this high demand for flak jackets. But in England, where does the flak gear go priority? It's to the 8th Air Force.
Yeah,
and so there's a kind of a push back and forth between 8th and 9th.
And do you think, Jeff, that there was a little bit of a hangover in sense of not panic, but Husky word had got out clearly. Some of the people had seen these things at first hand, some of the same pilots, some of the veteran paratroopers, that there was a sense of being not cautious, but making sure they pay extra special attention to the planning in this, in that, you know, there were things that happened in Husky that were kind of just unfortunate, bad luck things, but there are also aspects that were just under planned. So do you think there's a conscious sense that we must get this one right, and they're almost over planning it, or just being wise?
I think so. Yeah, they were given a year for the whole plan to become up a plan, and then the airborne piece, the intense airborne piece, starts really in February. So they have lots of time. And when Williams comes up from the Mediterranean and the 82nd leadership is there, now granted, all of the 82nd's not experienced, there is that sense of what we just did, we don't want to do it again. And then there's that idea, I think, of, you land in France, you get one shot, and what does it really mean? It means the end of the war. Right? It doesn't mean tomorrow is the end of the war. But if we successfully land in France, and, the American military is draft for the most part. So what are they going to do at the end of the war? They're going to go home. And how do they get to the end of the war to go home? They have to defeat Nazi Germany. And so I think there's this impetus to make sure that everything works right so that we can be done with this based on our experience in the Mediterranean theater and that leadership coming up and let's not make mistakes and let's make sure that this plan works.
And I suppose also just the fact they have this time. I mean, we've talked about Anzio and Salerno and other operations recently where they were planned over the matter of a weekend, or I'm exaggerating, but not much. And this, they have got the luxuries, maybe not the right word, but they have got the situation where they have got longer to plan it. So you may as well just spend that time. Otherwise, what are you going to do? All these staff officers, they might as well do something. So going over things again to make sure you've, like proofreading a military history book, you might as well keep going over it because you'll always pick up something, I suppose.
There's a bit of a double-edged sword. If you have too much planning time, then you get people with creative ideas.
Yeah.
So it's good to have plenty of time, but then there's also like this, let's be pragmatic and smart about what we're going to do. And for most part, Neptune, there were in the airborne world, there was no real crazy ideas, smaller ones, but nothing major. And then just go on communications. Well, the A5 planning under Troop Carrier Command, it stood up because the Troop Carrier Command decided that we needed a central office or a central location to bring all these people together. And so the A5 planning required the A3 to send representatives from Troop Carrier Command. They required the airborne divisions to send G3 representatives to these meetings. And so they all sit down at the table and come up with a plan at one time. And so there's not a plan here and a plan there. We're gonna do it together and make sure that it works right. And then they have the very important job of issuing the field order. A field order is the order that of the day that says this is how it's all going to come together, and it's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of pages, depending on the scale of the headquarters, in order to be executed. Which is kind of interesting because this mission changes right at the last minute with the 82nd, and so they have to issue a revision of it. Nothing totally out of the way. The communications piece, I think that's also really underappreciated. How do you talk to one another? You talk to one another through radio. How do you know that you talk to one another through radio? Wire is the predominant form of comms in World War II, but the airborne doesn't have the ability to reach to the rear through wire. Internally, they can do it. So they require radio, and operational security requires that you don't just talk out in the open. So how do you know who you're going to call? And how do you know what frequency it is and what call sign it is? And are they going to know that you're the real person or that you're a German trying to get into their radio net? And so they issue something called the Signal Operating Instructions in SOI, which is this really extensive instructions about who's who and radio frequencies, when you use them, passwords, colors of panels, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's absolutely vital in order to be able to do it. And it has to be that joint thing, right? Because you've got troop carrier and airborne mixed together. So they have to be able to communicate to one another. And if they can't, then the mission's going to fail. And then aside, public relations is another one of those things. The public relations officer, it's important to tell the story for the home front and to tell the enemy that we're doing this. How do you do that? Well, you do it through the public relations officers and office. And then they have to deal with such thing as, okay, well, I'm going to have print and radio primarily, and it's going to be military and civilian. Where am I going to embed them in this force so that they're effective in telling their story? And so there are reporters that jump with the 82nd and 101st, and there are reporters that go in with gliders, the 82nd and 101st, and there are reporters that fly with the Troop Carrier Command. And they come back and they either do radio broadcast or they do print stories. And then if you come back, they have to work with A2 here. So I'm the journalist. I write my story. I have to submit it for approval to be censored, as long as I'm not giving away any kind of information. So there's a whole kind of complex thing about what stories you put out and what kind of information you put out and when you put it out. So public relations is actually really cool. If you've ever seen an image of World War II and you see, I think you were telling me the other day, or you said one day in your Normandy, a great uncle had his image patched, right? That's the A2 in public relations scratching that out from one form that they release so that the information doesn't get out about what organization. But you also know that, because I think you had picture of it not being scratched.
Yeah, some photos were distributed 4 or 5 different times with as time passed, more amounts of information that was able to be divulged depending on the situation on the ground. So the first thing, you keep it very vague, troops in France, then later on you can start saying this is the so-and-so British King's Shropshire Light Infantry in Caen on July the so-and-so, because the need keeping it secure has passed. So so the same photo can be released under different sets of rules.
And that's the public relations folks doing.
Brilliant
Something
stuff.
that we don't necessarily think about, but I did a little research on that famous picture of Ike talking to the paratroopers, and it's actually a lot more complex than it seems like. And I got most of the information partly through the public relations release of the stuff.
Brilliant.
So here's the layout of as they get ready, troop carrier fields and where the 2 U.S. divisions are. I didn't include the Brits because again, this is a U.S. joint operation for the most part. I'd be happy to go down with the Brits too on a different day. Where do the troop carrier airfields go, and what are their requirements? So initially, when troop carrier comes in the fall of 1943, the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command are already here, and 9th Air Force medium bombers are already here, and their fighters are also here. And so East Anglia, I don't know if I can you see my arrow?
No, we can't. You can't. We have to describe where you're pointing, and we can't use mouse.
So if you look at that bump that kind of comes out above the words North Sea, that's East Anglia. 8th Air Force is in the middle and upper part and to the west, and Bomber Command is around there. And right above London into East Anglia is where the 9th Air Force medium bombers are.
Yeah.
And then down along the bottom coast is largely the fighters. And so where are you going to put these troop carrier guys? And they're going to come in with 90 airplanes in a group, and you're eventually going to get to 900 C-47s and thousands of gliders. What do you not want to happen? Is you don't want them to meet in the air. Right? So you have to separate them out, because this is a massive I can't imagine being in that airspace during the war, the amount of airplanes that are in there. So they moved initially they're up in the north near Leicester. Is that how I pronounce it?
Leicester,
around
yeah,
Leicester.
Nottingham,
Around Leicester. And so when they move them in there in the fall, where's the Airborne Division? Well, it's actually down in Berkshire where the 101st Airborne is. And so the 101st Airborne, when they arrive in September, October, November, they're moved down there. So it's, the Airborne Division's down there and the troop carriers up there. How are we going to train together? They start rotating the groups down to the Berkshire airfields, Ramsby and Welford, to work with the 101st, and that's kind of that's a logistical pain for the troop carrier groups. As they expand in February the level of troop carrier involvement, and they're going to have 14 groups, they say, okay, well, what we need to do is move some of the troop carrier forces down to the south, and then we'll leave some of them up in the north, and we'll bring up the 82nd from Northern Ireland, and we'll put them up in there in the north. And then when we get a little later, I'd probably go on way too long here. Where do you put the glider forces that are going to fly in? Well, they're going to need to be closer to France. So the 53rd Troop Carrier Wings is going to be the one down by around the 101st, and they're going to fly the glider missions. And then up north, around where the 82nd is in Leicester, is going to be the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing, and they're going to be primarily, almost exclusively, parachute missions for this year. What kind of fields do you need? Let's see if this is the right. So this is RAF Welford, where the 435th Troop Carrier Group was. It's a Berkshire airfield just west of Reading. And I don't know if clearly you can see on the image there, there's a triangle of runways. And so the reason the troop carrier forces could come down to Berkshire was thanks to Bomber Command. When Bomber Command was expanding, they developed and built operational training unit bases. And so these bases have hard runways, long runways, for their bombers to be able to work. And then Bomber Command decided they didn't need these operational training unit bases anymore. And so they gave them to troop carrier. So what kind of field does the troop carrier need? Well, they can't land on grass. So they need hard paved runways. And so they were able to use these OTU airfields in Berkshire. There's 5 of them that they move into. And so there's RAF Welford is one of them. Who's on these airfields? Well, there's the troop carrier groups, obviously. And the troop carrier commander is the base commander, station commander. But he actually has a variety of forces on there. So there's 9th Troop Carrier Command Forces, which is the troop carrier groups and some other maintenance guys. And then there's 9th Air Force Service Command, which is the big piece of the maintenance. And then there's 9th Air Force Command, which is the weather for the 9th Air Force, which is the weather squadrons. And then you get other Army organizations also on the base. So there's about 2,700 airmen and soldiers on this base on a daily average. And it's a really crowded and busy space, and they are training and training and training. So the airspace is really crowded. And if you ever see a map or look at the map where these 5 airfields are, it's amazing that they didn't glide in the air more often than they did, because their runways are often parallel or running into each other as they take off. So a very busy place. Now, when we talk about coming to execute the operation, you move the airborne forces to the airfields. Where do you put them? which is a question every airfield and troop carrier commander has to come up with. I have yet to figure out where they are in Welford. We have from what my supposition is that they're to the east and southeast a little bit of the airfield. But who houses them? Who's responsible for them? Who feeds them? And that goes back to that piece of the planning. The A4 talks to the service of supply. Service of supply comes in, sets up the tents, brings in units that are cooks, and they basically build a compound, a wired off compound, and the airborne move into that. And they stay in there, and then they don't really engage with the troop carrier except for when they're out at the airplanes, when they're either preloading the gliders or they're talking to them about what they got to do with it. So the airfields become this really, really busy space with it.
I just want to say thank you very much, Jeff, for giving me insight on things I thought I kind of knew, but I never really thought about, like the positioning of the airfields. I just looked at them and thought, oh, that's where they were, without really considering how they've got to fit them into the jigsaw puzzle that is all these air bases in 44. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just those down on the south coast there, Exeter and Zoyland. It's Mary. Sorry, right now.
Merryweather.
Merryweather. Yeah. So when they set them down there, these were there's no other room, so they move them down there. And again, if you think about the deployment piece, so the airborne's going to go. So the famous Easy Company 506 goes down there. So they have to leave their billetings, and they have to transport themselves or service of supply, transport them down to these airfields. Then they have to set up. Again, it's a really complex thing in order to be able to bring all of that together for the 5th of June, that morning launch, which eventually, of course, is going to become the 6th of June. All under operational security. Right? You don't want the Germans to know where they're going. And then just some of the 82nd 101st Airborne Division billets. Again, the 82nd was in Northern Ireland when they came from the Mediterranean. And then when they decided to use them as part of the initial assault force, they move them into the Leicester area, and they have to find billetings for them. Now, and then the 101st is moved pretty much where they were the whole time, which is Berkshire, a little bit west of that. But when they moved them in there, they had to find an open space, because who's already there? Other Allied forces, right? Both British forces and US forces. And so they have to squeeze them in between the armor and the infantry and all of these other forces. And so where do you find billeting for it? And then when you put them into a place, what does their division planners need to think about? Well, I need billeting, and I need to be able to have a road network that I can move them around. And I need training space, because I have to train. And so I need the ability to train with non-live fire exercises. And then I need live fire exercise space. And so you have to figure out small arms ranges. And then you got to figure out, where am I going to put my artillery? Because artillery needs to practice guns. And so there's a really complex piece about, I can train these days, I can't train these days. And then you throw in English weather and the variability about it. And so it's just another piece of the puzzle that these planners have to figure out before they go to execution. And then just some equipment. The top left picture is reverse Lend-Lease. It's a CG4A, but the gun in front of it is a British 6-pounder gun. They quickly realized in North Africa that the 37 millimeter NA-10 gun, which was standard for the US Army at the time, wasn't going to cut it with German armor. Our 57 millimeter caisson for the gun was too big to fit into a CG4A, but the British 6-pounder could fit in the CG4A. So we basically got British 6-pounder guns to become our anti-tank gun. And then that's what we use basically as the anti-tank gun for the rest of the war, is the British 6-pounder reverse Lend-Lease with that. That center picture on the left is a Horsa. We trained with the CG4As, and we knew the CG4As, and we get to Britain, and there's a new glider. They both have their positive parts, and they both have their negative parts. I think they're both good aircraft. They're made out of different material. I think, unfortunately for the US, our first use of them was in Normandy. Small fields, big glider, made out of wood. And there's kind of this myth that they were terrible gliders. And it's really more to do with the landing zones than it is with the glider. Because if you look at the rest of the operations, they're fine. And the same with CG4X, right? Smack the nose in these small fields and it's kind of thing. So we just started out in the landing zones that were too small for what we were trying to do. However, that's what we had. So we had to deal with it. And so what do you have to know? So the glidermen train on the CG4A, they know how to lash equipment into it. You lift the nose up, you load stuff that way. All of a sudden now they have to learn how to do a glider, a Horsa glider. Where the heck am I going to get a Horsa glider? So you talk to Troop Carrier Command Liaison Officer, you get Horsa gliders to come out to where the airborne are, or the airborne go where the gliders are. And you basically have to train on the ground in order to load and unload a Horsa glider and the differences between the CG-4A. And you can take a lot, as you know, a lot more in a Horsa than you can a CG-4A. So as a CG-4A, if I think, oh, I've got an artillery battalion, I'm going to need these many CG-4As to be able to do that. Oh, if I have Horsas, well, I only need half the number. So what does that mean? I'm going to have to cross load, and where am I going to put my guys? So you have to come up with completely different load plans, which requires somebody thinking it through, and then it requires the guys to be able to practice doing it in order to be able to do it successfully when it comes time for operation. Bottom right, how do you get those? The paratroopers get their extra equipment. It's pair of bundles and pair of packs. And on that color photo is a parapack panel, control panel. Who releases them? Is it the air crew or the ground? Is it the paratroopers? Actually, each group and each unit, it was never set. So it actually varies between airplanes and units. And do you release them before they jump or after they jump? Where are you in relationship to the drop zone? And where do you want to recover your gear? And so you have to come up with all of these drills. And when you land, you roll up your stick. I land as a paratrooper. Which way am I going? North, east, southwest. Where are my bundles? How am I going to assemble myself? And so all of that has to be worked out prior to the actual execution of it. And it's best if you work with air crews that you're going to fly with into combat, so you get to know one another. So there's a lot of preparatory training going on in the spring of 1944. And I've hit my hour mark. I don't know if we're.
Oh, no, keep going. We're loving it. It's good.
Okay, I think I'm close. So here's something that it's not news, world-shattering news, but there were two airborne plans. The first one was kind of constructed starting in February 1944. It was finalized in a plan released dated 2 May 1944, and it has the 82nd dropping on the west side of the Cotentin Peninsula. And so the left-hand map is the air routes, the top right-hand map is the drop zones, and then the bottom right-hand map is a close-up of the drop zones. And so the 101st gets the mission of basically securing St. Marigolese and the causeways. And the 82nd is given the mission of cutting off the Cotentin Peninsula, and so that reinforcements can't make it into the peninsula and be able to counterattack at the Utah beach. And it's seen as a vital thing. Now, the 82nd is a little hesitant on this because it's approximately, I think, 45 miles away from the beach. And so they're really cut off from the forces, but that's their mission. So they plan for it. Troop carrier plans for it too. So in the left-hand map, you can see there's assembly areas and then the movement across the, I don't know if you can clearly see that moving. I'm pointing my finger at it like somebody can see what I'm doing. Across the channel and then the backside of the Cotentin Peninsula. And you can see where they have one IP, which is the initial point on the coast, and then they go to their two drop zones with you. And then the return flight is different. The return flight is back on the same route that they just came from. And the reason they do that is because they don't want to fly, as you were pointing out earlier, Paul, is they don't want to fly over the landing forces, the Navy, because they're afraid the Navy's going to shoot them down like they did on Sicily. Right? So they move them back way. Now, Paul Williams, the commander, says, you know what, this is you're having us fly back over enemy territory that's not good for our planes and our crews because we have more missions to fly. So he advocated continually with the planning committees at SHAEF and the Navy in particular, let us fly over you, which has partly given birth to those black and white stripes. And then the orders did not shoot down at any aircraft within certain windows. But initially that they're not given permission to do that. And this is the first plan. And if you look at the drop zones for the 101st, there's an A, B, C, D. And if you know anything about the actual execution, there's an ACD and there's no B. And so this is the original plan for it. And then the 91st Luftlandedivision Division moves into the Cotentin Peninsula. We understand that it's happening, and on about the 22nd, 25th of May, they changed the plan on the 82nd. So they're not going to drop them where they were because they were afraid they would get cut off and cut off. So they're going to move them closer to the shore. And then here's the plan of execution. Again, it's almost the same route in and out, but route in, except that the IPs are split, one for the 82nd. But initial point is where that's the last leg till you get to where you're going to go to your target. Bombers have the same kind of thing. And so the western coast of the Cotentin Peninsula is the IP. There's two of them, one for the 82nd now and one for the 101st, so they don't cross as they're coming into their drop zones. And they get permission to fly out over the forces, the naval forces, and then come back and then go back to England because they've got more missions to fly. And what Williams is worried about is that if he flies back over the Cotentin and the Germans are awake now, that they're going to devastate his force, which he has limited crews and limited airplanes. And so if he has follow-on missions, it sounds like, well, I can't risk my crews. It's not risk to crews, it's risk to mission. If he loses crews and aircraft, then he won't be able to execute the mission, the follow-on missions. And then on the right is the drop zone piece of it there. We were talking beforehand about the drop zone piece and why the 101st did what they did. 3506, I think, always had the mission for the locks. Yep. I think it's in this, right?
Yeah, the bottom right.
When they shoot,
yep.
And the 502nd had the mission to secure St. Mary-Glees. And when they moved the 82nd missions over, and they literally just kind of moved them to the right, so they didn't have to change anything except the drop zones, landing zones. They moved the 502nd to what was drop zone B along the causeways, renamed it drop zone Able. And then it's the 502nd mission. And then the 2 battalions that were supposed to drop into Able, or Baker, originally got moved down to the Dog with 3506. So why the 101st kept the 502nd together and then split off a battalion from the 501st and 502nd, or 506th, and had them go mixed match? I've been looking for an answer for that for a while. It has to do with Taylor and the regimental commanders, whether he believed strongly in some battalion commander more than another battalion commander. And that kind of decision, it's why they split him up like that. But
that's what I'd always heard, because Taylor ends up being on drop zone C, and he wanted people like Kinnard and Ewell with him. Whereas if the 2 regiments had been each on their own designated DZ, it would have sort of not that wouldn't have happened. But I've always felt that seems an odd way to deploy your division, by splitting 2 of your regiments to 2 different drop zones. I mean, Colonel Sink, famously in the 506, has to monitor events and operations on drop zone C and drop zone D, which are even several miles apart as planned, and then end up being even more complicated with the scattering of jumps. So the 82nd, to me, with 1 regiment or 1 PIR per drop zone, seems a more solid plan to me. But what the hell do I know?
I don't know that, my experience in it is that, like you were saying, I think it's a division commander making a decision about confidence in regimental and battalion commanders.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying any one of them is better than another. I'm just thinking that is my assessment on it, is that somebody.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, you said earlier, Jeff, that Maxwell Taylor, he's still not flavor of the month yet. But he has got some friends, and it makes sense that while he's still establishing himself in the 101st Airborne, and we know, folks, that some of the men who are loyal to General Bill Lee supposedly jumped out of the aircraft shouting Bill Lee, as some would shout out Geronimo, is that having some friends near him who he trusts is maybe a better way of kind of getting his operation off to a start than there's interesting aspects to the whole Taylor's relationship with the division that are quite complex. But yeah,
he's a complex guy. Yeah, he's a complex guy. He is. Politician, an officer, a brave officer. I'm not talking about. He's just a complex guy.
Yeah, I mean, they all are. I mean, and John McManus is working on a biography of Ridgway now, who he's realizing is far more complicated as well than perhaps first thought. And that's the nature of some of these commanders. They're coming from a kind of sometimes an old school environment. I say, as you said, Taylor was an artillery officer, but they're dealing with a new concept, a new doctrine. So they were sparky characters, and they were clearly intelligent, but they were also complicated.
And career oriented. Ridgway is always like, the icon of 82nd Airborne and paratroopers. In varsity, he couldn't be quick enough to get rid of that and be a groundist, because he was thinking post-war career, right? He's thinking, what am I going to be? And he's successful with it. So,
yeah, no, definitely.
I think I'm almost done there. So it's really hard to see these last 2 slides, but it's the complexity of the movement table, the air movement table. And so how do you? This is, again, you look at the table, there's the 1st to 502nd. It's going to go to this airfield, and it's going to go to that landing zone. That is a really complex thing. So how many airplanes does a battalion need? And so you have the line companies and you have the headquarters company. Do they need the same number of airplanes? So if I have to have 9 airplanes or 45 airplanes, do I send them all to the same airfield so they're all take off and land at the same time? Or does it not matter because they're going to go to the same drop zone? Where do I put them in the order of the airplanes? Do I put the leader up front, or is the leader in the second plane? Is the deputy leader going to be in the 5th plane? Where is the anti-tank? Where's my anti-tank weapons going to be? Where are my machine guns going to be? Where are the infantry squad? Where are my RTOs going to go? All of that has to come into play on the ground forces piece, and then they meet the troop carrier piece and go, okay, these are your requirements. You need 45 airplanes. Okay, well, let me see how we can do this. Well, you want 20 people in this plane. Well, you can't do that. I can only put 18. but you have to move 2 guys over to this plane, which is going to break a ground unit, right? Because you assume they're going to land together, but in reality, that's just not going to happen, because especially if it's in dark. And so they have to come together with this massive 2 interests and figure out a really complex piece of the puzzle. And then the glider forces is the same way. What do you want? Well, I want an artillery piece in this glider, and they're going to fly in 4 pairs. So right, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, going from top right to bottom left. You want the gun in the top right, the Jeep in the next one, the trailer in the next one, and ammo in the next one. So essentially, the 4 gliders are 1 piece of artillery, so that when they land, in theory, if they're landing next to each other, boom, they're right there, and they can go off and execute. And then, well, what if I only have so many gliders? And so it's where do I put these pieces in the glider? Where am I going to put the comm piece, the backup radios? And so air movement tables they're great resources, and they look, well, it's simple. There's so many people there, these chalks there going that way, but they're really complex to be able to construct. And then there's the complexity of the actual execution, because at the last minute, somebody could change something and move that Jeep over there, or that Jeep broke down, so there's no Jeep in that one, and they're going to go over here. So movement tables are a guide, but they're not an end-all be-all of trying to figure out who went where with what in the actual execution of a mission. So the 101st, this is the first air movement table. The only thing they really had to change was the gliders, and so they changed the number of gliders going in. They didn't have to change where the units were going to what airfields. But then they had to change the drop zone. So there wasn't a lot of complexity, except that they moved where they were going to drop, which then, of course, means new maps to A2, and then new plans and all that kind of stuff. And then for the 82nd, this is the 82nd's movement, the actual one they executed. So they had to draw this up within a matter of days. Now, luckily, again, as I said earlier, all they did was basically move the forces from west to east, and so they could stay together, which meant that the 505 could go up to Spanahow, or part of 505 could go there. So they didn't really change the way they engaged with the troop carrier forces, but then they had to come up with the change of drop zone to landing zones, which again goes back to planning. The maps, you have to tell the troop carrier guys, they've been training to go to a different DZ and LZ, reading the maps, and now they have to go to a new set of things for execution. So it's again a last minute, really complex piece of it. So I think I would close with that. Planners are never really paid attention to. They don't make the history books. They don't make the reports because they stay at the headquarters. Some of them will go into combat. Some of the glider pilot planners went into combat to get the experience of doing it, and then take that experience back to planning. Planners never really make the story, and they don't make the rosters. They're just the senior guy of the G3 or the A3 who's on the list, and nothing about the guys that are underneath them that work a lot hard on it. And I just wish that somehow there's a way to bring to light their contribution, which is absolutely vital in order to make an operation execute well. And that's,
no, thank you.
That's my spiel.
We will do some questions, and some of them that were asked earlier, you ended up answering as we went on, which I kind of thought it was going to happen. One question that did come up that I think is worth addressing is the Peter O'Connell said, question for later perhaps, Normandy suggests nighttime favors glider assaults, Market Garden suggests daytime favors parachute assaults. Any thoughts? They
tried glider. The troop carrier did not want to do glider landings at night. They tried it in England. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Bradley famously said, or didn't say, he said, well, if I can't use the gliders, then what's the point of them? Get rid of them. I'm kind of ad-libbing there. And so what the gliders bring into a division it's again, I'm a paratrooper. So who's God's gift to the world? Paratroopers. Right? And I didn't really understand what a glider force does. And it was the same attitude in World War II. Paratroopers would be nothing without the gliders because they bring in the heavy stuff, the guns. The artillery, the anti-tank weapons. And so the compromise for the night glider landing for Operation Neptune was to bring in anti-tank guns for both divisions. A few hours after the paratroopers land, it doesn't go very well in the landing, but it does go very well in the execution, because what saves Lafayette and Northern Saint-Mary-Gilles? The 6-pounder anti-tank guns. They came in at early morning glider landings and CG-4As, and they got them to where they needed to be, and they helped save the day for the 82nd. Normally in that story, it's very rarely said, they just say, oh, there's a gun there. They never actually say, well, actually, that's the glider force doing that. If you didn't have the glider in, then you wouldn't have saved the day that way. And then, so the glider brings in the next day, later on the 6th, all the 320th Glider Field Artillery, all the artillery, and then the 82nd on the 7th brings in the 325 So the troop carrier didn't want to do glider landings at night because they thought they would be unsuccessful on a large scale. And my feeling is they probably would have been, but they were successful in day. I think a daytime operation is always going to be better, paratrooper or glider, because everybody can see where they're going. Market was successful because we had such air superiority over the battle space. And we spent the morning of each drop or landing hammering the German anti-aircraft systems. And then we bring in the gliders with it. And the paratroops the same. The first day, air support comes in, hammers the Germans, and then the paratroops come in. So glider, I think daytime ops are always optional. That answered the question on it.
Okay, thank you. And Gary August is saying, were smaller scale glider ops a better option than Pegasus at night? And I think, no offense to Gary's question there, is I think I'm becoming to realize that maybe our perception of Neptune and the airborne operations is a little bit warped by some of the attention some operations have got. And there's a sense that, well, Pegasus Bridge, their glidings there were precision, and yet all the other gliders landed all over the place. And that's not really true. You look at the packed landing zones in the British sector, full of horses, a lot of them in the right place, and there are those packed fields up in around San Mariglis or south of San Mariglis packed with gliders. So we're stuck with the way we all of us have these preconceived ideas about. But from your point of view, it's maybe a yes or no question. Do you think we have an accurate understanding of the airborne operations, or are we a bit warped by kind of Hollywood and mythology?
I think we're warped by Hollywood and mythology. I think there's a voice there trying to change that tone. Your channel is actually one of those things who has.
We're trying, yeah.
Troop carrier folks, but I think when you talk, gliders were World War II, and then after World War II, the aircraft changed, and you had ability to do heavy drops. So gliders quickly faded, and nobody. Oh, a gliderman, what's that? Is that a pilot, or is that a glider rider, or is there? So yeah. I think that they just didn't get paid attention to, and the value. Gavin is a paratrooper. Gavin, I think, I don't have heroes, but if there was an officer I would follow to hell, it would have been Gavin. But he was a paratrooper and a paratrooper through and through. He believed in the 82nd Airborne Division, but would he rather have paratroopers than glidermen? If he could, probably. And so I think glider riders just they start out the war not being volunteers. Eventually they do get wings and pay and all that kind of stuff. I think they were always undervalued unless you look at the actual operational execution and what they bring to the fight, which is that artillery and the anti-tank guns and the mobility and all those radios and batteries that they're going to need to fix them when they drop.
Yeah, thank you. Ian is asking, were C-47 losses similar to what the expectations were?
Fraction. I don't remember the number. Lee Mallory, that guy, that wonderful guy.
Well, Lee Mallory is always overly negative. Eeyore, as I called him. Yeah, what was his 70% of all airborne forces we killed before in the ground? He was projecting the very, very worst case scenario. But yeah,
9th Troop Carrier Command was probably projecting somewhere in the 20% of damage. And you got to think from the air piece, it's an aircraft lost or an aircraft damaged, how extensive the damage is, so that when they get back to the field, how quickly can they fix it and turn it around for the next mission. And it was a fraction of what they were thinking it was going to be.
I just want to kind of touch on what you said about the way the story is told, because I heard a few people. I was at Lafayette twice over the last few days, and some very good tour guides. One particular guy I'm thinking of, who's ex-Airborne Forces, American Airborne Forces, was stressing the importance of small unit leadership and the NCO and the platoon leaders, and all of that is true. All of that is an essential, integral, and vital part of the airborne ethos. But it maybe comes at the expense of looking at the planning, looking at the fact that a lot of foresight had gone in. There's this kind of idea, they just kind of went in there, didn't matter where they were, they get on and got the job done. And we talked about that with Marty Morgan, this idea that we have this idea that most of the guys were a long way away from their drop zones, when in fact most of them were actually on their drop zones. That the scattered ones were remarkable stories and have drawn the attention, but a lot of guys were very, very close to where they were supposed to be.
And then that unfamiliar, you could drop the key for a paratrooper, you roll up your stick. I'm told I'm going to go to the north side of the drop zone, so I go and get my stuff and go. If there's a hedgerow all of a sudden in between me and that, I'm like, what is this? It's easy to get confused and lost in that dark and that unfamiliar space with it.
And then I know it's possibly a subject we could discuss on a future show, but you mentioned the creation of the first Allied Airborne Command, and that comes into play later on in the war. Do you think that was the right move? Was that the right thing to do in the middle of a war, to bring in an entirely new organization? Given that you said there's already these issues with the Army Air Corps and the Army, and do you think that was a good idea? I mean, Varsity kind of proves it was, and Market Garden kind of proves it wasn't. I don't know.
I think the concept was good for the European theater of operations just because of the scale of the force there. Right? No other theater had that kind of scale of airborne force. So as a concept, like, well, it's the true joint, right? And combine. Okay, we got this kind of force. We need to work together to be able to execute properly. I think the problem was I think a problem with it was personalities. You had Brereton as pointed as the commander. Yeah. Initially, it was Browning as deputy, and then Browning got booted, and then Gale, I think, became the next deputy. And then you're supposed to rack and stack. You had American, British. Brereton didn't do that, and it was a planning headquarters. Then the war was over, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was. I think in concept, if we had another grand scale war, I don't want one. That kind of jointness would be good. We in the military of the United States still try to do it. We have combatant commands, one for Europe, one for Latin America. And it's that idea to bring that force together under one commander so they can know best how to execute in their theater, which Eisenhower was. It was just that force of, Harrison Bomber Command, Spots with the Strategic Command. So an idea I think was good. I don't know if it was executed well.
I think Brereton somehow has managed to avoid a lot of criticism over the years, particularly with Market Garden. And if his ghost is out there, watching the way, he think, well, why is no one pointing the finger at me for everything? Everyone's blaming Montgomery, Eisenhower, but to me, and this is going down a massive rabbit hole, you cannot look at the failures of Market Garden without pointing quite a lot of fingers at Brereton for various reasons: personality, planning, failure to deploy, use the troop carriers, failure of this, and yet he seems to always escape any kind of criticism.
I think it's because he was, to me, that, like we were talking about, what is the FAA, the First Allied Airborne Army, and the problem with it was that they imagined themselves being something that the subordinate commands would never let them do. Mm-hmm. So for Troop Carrier Command, the First Allied Airborne Army took that on as an organization, and it went away from 9th Air Force. So they stopped wearing the 9th Air Force emblem. That's when that troop carrier patch comes in. But the RAF never gave up any transport airplanes to the First Allied Airborne Army. So 38 Group didn't belong to them. They could borrow them. 46 Group was part of Transport Command, so it never belonged to them. So there was never buy-in from the next level down, I think, about execution. And you're going to bring in Bradley and Montgomery and all that conflict about whose forces are what. And so I think it was actually a relatively ineffective headquarters due to the nature of the environment that it was created in, and I think in part due to the nature of its leadership. His staff, Cutler, I think Cutler was his G3, came from the States, was not an airborne guy. It doesn't mean he couldn't adapt and become that, but it was kind of like, why? It's a good idea. It was hatched by Eisenhower earlier in 44.
And then, of course, the other side is once you've got an airborne command, you're going to have to use it. Once you've created it, if it's not used at Market Guard, it's going to be used at some point because it's the shiny new toy in the toy box. And so therefore you're going to use it. Whereas the evolution, we're going down a massive rabbit hole again. The evolution of airborne forces was sort of from small kind of hit and run independent operations to larger and larger divisional, and then as we know, the 82nd 101st attached to 7th Corps. They're part of the integral Overlord or Neptune assault, whereas earlier it was almost just commando missions, wasn't it? And you see that cranking up in scale as the war goes on, which is fascinating. But I think it's time to bring things to an end, except everyone's saying, bring him back. This has been brilliant, fantastic. And the questions you ended up asking most of them as he went on, so which is fantastic. So that's good. So we'll bring you back. But folks, I'm back again tomorrow. Dylan is back to do the show that didn't happen because of tech problems a couple of weeks ago, to talk about 11 groups control of the Air Armada on June the 6th. That'll be fantastic. And then there's two more shows on Friday, and then the weekend off. But thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody, for your fantastic questions. And did you enjoy it, Jeff?
I absolutely did. Thank you. It was what I expected, which was a fun, enjoyable engagement. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So, folks,
see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Bye.